Let's resume. Now, before going to the break, we discussed the three different elements of biosphere. We discussed chemosynthesis. Also, we discussed gas hydrates, polymetallic nodules, the diminishing number of vultures. All these things we have completed. Now, let's see the other terms today. Now, the first term that we want to discuss is called as what? It's called as ecology. Now, the term ecology was given by Ernest Haeckel in 1869 and it's derived from two words, oikos and logos. Oikos means habitat and logos means study. But in UPSC, we do not write things like this, oikos, logos. The more meaningful things to write, more logical things to write. In nature, we can see two different types of interactions taking place, mutual interaction taking place. One mutual interaction is taking place between the biotic components, means plants, animals, microorganisms would be interacting among themselves. And second, good afternoon everybody. And second mutual interactions would be taking place between biotic and abiotic component. Plants, animals, microorganisms would be interacting with atmosphere, lithosphere and hydrosphere, the abiotic component. So there are two types of mutual interaction, one between the biotic component themselves and second between biotic and abiotic components. Now these mutual interactions are responsible for what? They are responsible for determining species diversity. They are responsible for not only determining species diversity, but they also determine the nature of species, the types of species. They are also responsible for determining the abundance of species, the genetic variation. So, in one single sentence, we can say that they are responsible for determining species diversity, genetic variation. Species diversity means what kind of species should be present in that area. Genetic variation means within the species there can be genetic variation, and also abundance of species, the number of species. So when we say ecology, ecology is not only the study of habitat in which an organism lives, but also the study of mutual interactions which is taking place in nature, and that is between the biotic component themselves and biotic and abiotic component, which is responsible for determining species diversity and also not only species diversity but also their abundance. So this would be called as ecology. Clear first. But when we talk about the term ecosystem, ecosystem is what? Ecosystem is fundamental unit of biosphere. Suppose we look outside, whatever we see outside is nothing but biosphere. But if we take a fundamental unit of biosphere, one unit of biosphere, which consists of three similar components. Three similar components means biotic, abiotic and energy component. So if we take a fundamental unit of biosphere consisting of three similar components, biotic, abiotic and energy component, this fundamental unit of biosphere would be called as what? It would be referred to as ecosystem. Clear? It would be referred to as ecosystem. Sometimes ecosystem can be large. For example, terrestrial ecosystem, coastal ecosystem. These are large ecosystem. Sometimes it can be small. For example, if we talk about the small ecosystem, a small ecosystem can exist anywhere. It can exist inside the body itself. How? Because if suppose we talk about you have asked me, Mandeep, question with the extraction of PMNs from the CIOB, Central Indian Ocean Basin, how will the ecology of the sea floor be affected? See, there won't be any impact on the sea floor because PMNs are not utilized by marine organisms. Hardly that would be disrupting the food chain. They won't be disrupting. So these are natural rock-like structures which are present, and they are not utilized by marine organisms as such, but only is responsible for forming the part of the oceanic floor. So it won't be hampering the marine ecosystem. Suppose we also extract gas hydrates, it won't hamper the marine ecosystem. Because unless the food reservoir of marine organism is disrupted, there won't be any impact. Or suppose the oxygen which is present inside, dissolved, in a dissolved form it is present inside the ocean, which is required for the survival of marine organism, that is disrupted through contamination. Then the marine ecosystem would be affected. But extraction solely won't be responsible for affecting the marine ecosystem. Clear? Now, we can see that if suppose a question is asked to you like this, that which cell in human body is in the largest numbers? Which cell in the human body is in the largest number? There would be many answers to that. Somebody will say RBC, somebody will say WBC, somebody will say skin cell. But the cell which is present in human body in largest numbers, the cell which is present in human body in largest numbers is what? It is bacterial cells. If the question is like this, which cell of human body is present in largest numbers, then it would be nerve cells. But if it is, the question is like this, which cell inside human body is present, in human body is present in largest number, it would be the bacterial cells. And 90% of cells inside our body are bacterial cells. How? Because some of the food stuff that we consume, they are called as what? They are called as probiotic food. Probiotic food means they are supplying our body with good bacterial cells. So they are referred to as probiotic food. And these kind of foodstuffs, probiotic foods, are responsible for enhancing what? These bacterial cells, they accumulate inside the gut of the human body and is present in, just one second. See, as far as detrivore is concerned, detrivore is saprophyte means decomposition of dead plants and animals. Detrivore is also responsible for decomposition of dead plants and animals, but detrivore includes a wide term. It's a more comprehensive term, under which not only the worms, the fungus, the bacteria are responsible, and they are feeding upon what? They are feeding upon detritus. Detritus is what? Detritus is the organic matter which is present. Clear? So that is feeding upon, the detrivores would be responsible for feeding upon the detritus, which is the organic matter. So you can see detrivores would be a more comprehensive term. Then saprophytes, which is responsible for decomposition of dead plants and animals. Saprophytes, when they decompose dead plants and animals, they are responsible for deriving their nutrition from such decomposition only. But detrivores feed on detritus, which is the organic matter which is present in the environment and is due to such decomposition only. So that's considered to be a more wider term. Why all vultures breeding center? There's no hard fast rule for this purpose. You cannot say that only vultures are present in northern. If suppose Nandankanan is not in the north. If suppose you say Gujarat is not north. If you say extremely south, then yes, we do not have vulture conservation and breeding centers in extremely south. But there are vulture conservation and breeding centers in Gujarat, in Nandankanan, also in Odisha, in Hyderabad. Hyderabad is what? South? Isn't it south or is it north? Majority of them are in the north, but does not mean that we do not have in south. Clear? Now see, first of all, write ecology. What is ecology? And then we come to the other terms. Write down ecology. Ecology is not only the study of, ecology is not only the study of habitat in which an organism lives, habitat in which an organism lives, habitat in which an organism lives, but also the study of mutual interactions, mutual interactions in nature, which would be of two types, mutual interactions in nature, which would be of two types, between the biotic component themselves, and second, between abiotic and biotic components, between the biotic component themselves, and second, between abiotic and biotic component. And we can see what is the need of these interactions, why these interactions would be conducted. Now, these interactions are responsible for what? It is responsible for not only determining species diversity, but also genetic variation and also abundance of species. All these three would be determined, right? And these interactions are responsible for determining species diversity, genetic variation, and also abundance of species. Genetic variation and also abundance of species. So ecology is a term which is used for all these things. Not only the study of habitat in which an organism lives, that won't be only considered as ecology. So it is this that would be considered as ecology. Fine. Second, you have to know ecosystem. We have just now discussed that ecosystem is the fundamental unit of biosphere, which would be consisting of three similar components: biotic component, abiotic component, and energy component. Ecosystem can be large, like terrestrial, like coastal ecosystem, it can be large, or it can be small, like that constituted by bacterial cells inside the human body. So that would be a small ecosystem because that has been constituted by the bacterial cells inside the human body. So that's a small ecosystem that we are talking about. Clear? So it can be large, it can be small, like that constituted by bacterial cells inside the human body. Because when you consume food, some food like curd, now these food are responsible for supplying you good bacterial cells. So these bacterial cells accumulate inside the gut of human body, the gut which is responsible for developing your immune system. So inside the human body we can see an ecosystem of these bacterial cells would be present. It has been formed inside the gut of human body. So this is an ecosystem existing on a low scale inside the human body itself, and they are deriving their nutrition from the food stuff that we eat. They derive because the food stuff that we eat is not entirely digested by us. The part which is not digested by us would be called as prebiotic. So from this part, the bacterial cells are responsible for getting their nutrition. Clear? From these parts that they are getting their nutrition. So we can see, as far as nutrition is concerned, they would be getting the nutrition from the food and they are present inside the human body. Now they are forming an ecosystem of their own. You would have, suppose you go from your home to visit some place, you return back after some time. Inside the bucket where the water was filled, you can feel slippery. Why? Because of the presence of bacteria. The bacteria has formed an ecosystem of their own inside your bucket. So it means that ecosystem can exist on a large scale, it can exist on a small scale, like that constituted by bacterial cells inside the human body. Write down ecosystem. Ecosystem. The second next term is ecosystem. It is the fundamental unit of biosphere. It is the fundamental unit of biosphere. A unit of biosphere, which consists of three components, biotic, abiotic, and energy component, which consists of three components, three similar components also you can write. Ecosystem can be large. Ecosystem can be large. Ecosystem can be large, like terrestrial or coastal ecosystem. Ecosystem can be large, like terrestrial or coastal ecosystem. Terrestrial or coastal ecosystem. Or it can be small. Or it can be small, like that constituted by bacterial cells, inside the human body, And just now we have discussed that bacterial cells are maximum inside the human body, although of the human body, if we say, the maximum number is that of nerve cell, but inside human body maximum number is that of bacterial cells, like that constituted by bacterial cells inside the human body. Clear? So that two, we are talking about large ecosystem and a small ecosystem. Fine. Now, if suppose we talk about ecosystem, we know that ecosystem consists of three components, that is abiotic, biotic, and energy component. But if we take the biotic component itself and make a subdivision of the biotic component, now this subdivision of the biotic component of ecosystem, would be referred to as what? It would be called as community. This would be referred to as what? It would be called as community. This subdivision of biotic component of ecosystem would be referred to as what? It would be called as community. Fine. And for example, I give you, in forest ecosystem, there would be a community which would be present on the surface, land surface of the forest. For example, deers, tigers, lions would be forming a community of their own. Now, there would be a community which would be present at the canopy of trees. Owls, vultures, eagles would be forming a community of their own. So, we can see that within an ecosystem, there can be different levels of community. And members of community perform certain functions for their maintenance. So here we are saying that community is what? Community is nothing but a biotic subdivision. We are taking the biotic component itself and making a subdivision. So biotic subdivision of the ecosystem would be called as what? It would be referred to as community. And within a community, there would be within an ecosystem, there would be different levels of community. Write down. A biotic subdivision of the ecosystem. A biotic subdivision of the ecosystem. A biotic subdivision of the ecosystem is referred to as a biotic subdivision of the ecosystem is referred to as community. Biotic subdivision of the ecosystem is referred to as community. And A biotic subdivision of the ecosystem is referred to as community. And within an ecosystem, there can be different levels of community. And within an ecosystem, there can be different levels of community. Ecosystem, there would be different levels of community. Clear? And the members of community would be performing certain functions for their maintenance. So the functions that they perform, for example, suppose we are talking about any member of the community, the functions that they perform for their own maintenance, for their own survival. Now these functions would be collectively referred to as what? It would be referred to as niche. So the members of the community, you know what is community? Community is nothing but a biotic subdivision of the ecosystem. And ecosystem is what? It is a fundamental unit of biosphere. Biosphere is what? Biosphere is called as the organic world. It is that part of the earth where organisms are present, and it consists of three components: biotic, abiotic and energy component. Now here we see that community, the members of community are performing certain functions for their maintenance. These functions would be collectively referred to as niche, or we can say in other words, the functional aspect of members of ecosystem would be referred to as niche. And niche would be of three different types depending upon the functions that they perform. If suppose the function is food accumulation, then this kind of niche would be called as what? This kind of niche would be called as trophic niche. If the function is suppose not food accumulation, if suppose the function is suppose procreation, generating new ones, then the niche would be called as what? Then the niche would be referred to as not trophic niche, but the niche would be called as what? It would be called as reproductive niche. And if the function is maintenance of dwelling place, it would be called as habitat niche. You would have seen that birds, they collect small sticks and they are responsible for building up the nest. So they are making what? They are making their nest. So this is habitat niche. You would have seen birds collecting small grains and feeding their young ones. Now this is trophic niche. If suppose the function is procreation, then it would be called as reproductive niche. Write down niche. Niche. Members of community perform certain functions. Members of community perform certain functions. Members of community perform certain functions for their maintenance. Which is collectively referred to as niche, which is collectively referred to as niche. If the function is food accumulation, it is referred to as trophic niche. If the function is food accumulation, it is referred to as trophic niche. If the function is maintenance of dwelling place, then it is referred to as, if the function is maintenance of dwelling place, it is referred to as habitat niche. And if the function is procreation means generation of new ones, and if the function is procreation, it is referred to as reproductive niche. reproductive niche. Reproductive niche. So if the function is food accumulation, trophic niche. If the function is maintenance of dwelling place, then it's called as habitat niche. If the function is procreation, then it would be called as reproductive niche. Clear? So these are three types of niche. Now that's another term. And then come to the term which is called as ecotone. Ecotone. So let's see what exactly is ecotone. Finished? Suppose, just note it down. Finished? Okay, let's move. Suppose on one side we have one ecosystem. Suppose this is on one side we have one ecosystem. And on the other side we are having another ecosystem. On the other side we are having another ecosystem. So we can see the demarcation zone between two ecosystems. This is suppose the demarcation zone. This demarcation zone between two ecosystems would be referred to as what? It would be called as ecotone. The demarcation zone between two ecosystems would be called as what? It would be referred to as ecotone. And it's not only the demarcation zone, it's also a zone of competition. And why zone of competition? Suppose this is your land and this is the sea. Now ecotone would be the mangrove areas, mangrove swamps would be called as ecotone. Or suppose this is the river, this is the sea. This is the estuary. So estuary is also demarcation zone between river ecosystem and marine ecosystem. So this would be called as ecotone. So the first thing about ecotone is what? That ecotone, if we talk about the first thing about ecotone. Now ecotone is what? Ecotone is not only a demarcation zone between two ecosystems, but also zone of competition. It is also a zone of competition. Second thing is what? Zone of competition. And second thing is what? That as far as ecotone is concerned, ecotone is a zone which is transitional in nature. Why we are saying transitional in nature? Because the characteristic of one ecosystem would be reducing and that of the other would be enhancing. For example, suppose in mangrove areas you can see the soil is what? The soil is saline in nature. So the characteristic of one ecosystem is reducing and that of the other is enhancing. So we can see in this area the soil is saline in nature. The third thing about ecotone is what? In this area, it's not only zone of competition because the members of two ecosystems would be striving hard for their survival. It's a transitional zone also. And in this area, the margin of two ecosystems is overlapping with each other. So if the margin of two ecosystems is overlapping with each other, what will happen? The localized condition in this area would be favorable for generation of a large number of species. Now this phenomena is called as what? This phenomena is referred to as edge effect. Edge effect. But it does not mean that the types of species which are present in ecotone would be called as what? Would be referred to as edge species. Would be referred to as edge species. Edge species is altogether a different concept. Some of the books they have mentioned that the species which are present in this area would be referred to as what? Would be referred to as edge species. But edge species is altogether a different concept. And what is that? Edge species stands for evolutionary distinct and globally endangered. It means that these species are only surviving member of their genus on the planet Earth. They are the only surviving member of their genus on the planet Earth. Clear? And for example, suppose elephant can be called as edge species, as the mammoth is no longer there. So they are the only surviving member of their genus on the planet Earth. But it does not have to do anything with the edge effect. Clear? So we cannot link edge species with the edge effect. We cannot link that, the edge species with the edge effect. Clear? Right, write down. Next term is what? Next term is ecotone. Ecotone. It is the demarcation zone between two ecosystems. It is the demarcation zone between two ecosystems. Zone between two ecosystems. It is the demarcation zone between two ecosystems. So first thing is what? That it is the demarcation zone. It is also called as the transitional zone. It is also called as the transitional zone. Transitional zone. As it is also called as the transitional zone, as the characteristic of one ecosystem, as the characteristic of one ecosystem would be reducing, as the characteristic of one ecosystem would be reducing, and that of the other would be enhancing, as the characteristic of one ecosystem would be reducing and that of the other would be enhancing. That of the other would be enhancing. Examples include many. For example, we have discussed mangrove swamps. Sundarbans of West Bengal is nothing but an ecotone. Estuary is an ecotone because it separates two ecosystems, river ecosystem and marine ecosystem. Transitional zone. So it's not only a demarcation zone but also transitional zone, as the characteristic of one ecosystem reduces and that of the other enhances. Third, it is also a zone of competition. It's also a zone of competition. Zone of competition. As the members of two ecosystem, as the members of two ecosystem, as the members of two ecosystem would be, members of two ecosystem would be struggling hard for their survival, would be, it's also zone of competition, as the members of two ecosystems. Don't write struggling hard, but you can write competing with one another for their survival. As the members of two ecosystems compete with one another, would compete with one another for their survival, compete with one another for their survival, and not only a demarcation zone, transitional zone, competition zone, but we can also see that this area would be registering high ecological productivity. Ecological productivity means the rate at which photosynthesis is performed. And why? Because the biodiversity of this area is very high. Clear? Write down. In this area, localized condition, localized condition is favorable for, localized condition is favorable for development of a large number of species. Localized condition is favorable for development of a large number of species. This phenomena is called edge effect. This phenomena is called edge effect. edge effect. So we can see in this area the localized condition is favorable, and why? Because the margin of two ecosystem is overlapping. So localized condition in this area is favorable for development of a large number of species, and this area consists of immense biodiversity. So this area would be, this phenomena would be called as what? This phenomena would be called as edge effect, but do remember that it has nothing to do with edge species. So in some books that they have mentioned the species present in this area would be called as edge species is entirely wrong, because edge species stands for what? Stands for evolutionary distinct and globally endangered. They are the only surviving member of their genus on the planet Earth. So they are called as edge species, referred to as edge species. Localized condition favorable for development of a large number of species. So this phenomena is called as edge effect. Right on. They also register high ecological productivity. They also register high ecological productivity. High ecological productivity. They also register high ecological productivity. High ecological productivity. Now this is called as what? This is nothing but ecotone that we have discussed. Clear? Fine. But see, in between we discussed edge species, which is evolutionary distinct and globally endangered. We say that they are the only surviving member of their genus on the planet Earth. And why? Because the other members have vanished. And we talked about the elephant being one example, because mammoth is no longer there. But there are some other species which need to be remembered from environmental perspective. One such a species is called as what? It is called as keystone species. Keystone species means that these type of species are necessary to maintain the structure of the ecosystem. Structure of the ecosystem. Because if the structure of the ecosystem is disrupted, if these species are taken out from the ecosystem, the structure of the ecosystem would be disrupted. So that's called as keystone species. I give you an example. And now, if you take out starfish from the marine ecosystem, coastal ecosystem, the entire coastal ecosystem gets disrupted, because there would be sudden enhancement in mussels or chimps in large numbers. Or suppose just like monkeys, there are lemurs. Lemurs are present in Madagascar in abundance. But if suppose lemurs are removed from Madagascar, the ecosystem of Madagascar would be disrupted. How? Because the vegetation, we can see that the seeds of some vegetation have to pass through the digestive tract of lemur in order to germinate. The seeds of some vegetation have to pass through the digestive tract of lemur in order to germinate. It means what? That if lemurs are not present, how will they germinate? Their seeds won't be germinating. So these kind of species would be removed. And keystone species can be both plants and animals. For example, in temperate area, there is a type of plant which is called as fig plant. If you see the fruits of these plants, the fruits of these plants are hard-shelled, stony in nature. They are hard-shelled, they are stony in nature. But, and in favorable condition, the monkeys won't be consuming these fruits. But in the unfavorable condition, if suppose we talk about unfavorable condition, we can see that monkeys would be consuming these fruits for their survival. So ensuring the survival of monkeys in adverse condition is the fig plant, and maintaining the structure of the ecosystem is the fig plant. Henceforth, this would be called as what? It would be referred to as keystone species. It would be referred to as keystone species. Fine. So that's the definition of keystone species, that they are, see, they would be ensuring the survival of other species, they maintain the abundance of other species, that's known. But most important part would be that they are responsible for maintaining the structure of the ecosystem. Because if you remove them from ecosystem, the entire ecosystem is going to be disrupted. So that's called as keystone species. Then there is a type of, first of all, write down these two, write down species. And these are species which are important from environmental perspectives. Let's write down the two and then we discuss the other 3 or 4. 3 there are more. First is your edge species. Edge species. The full form is, write down, it stands for evolutionary distinct. It stands for evolutionary distinct and globally endangered. Evolutionary distinct and globally endangered. Globally endangered. They are the only surviving member of their genus. They are the only surviving member of their genus. They are the only surviving member of their genus. On Earth. They are the only surviving member of their genus on Earth. Only surviving member of their genus on Earth. Clear? For example, elephant. For example, elephant. Elephant. Clear? So that's called as edge species. Second, keystone species. Keystone species. They are responsible for maintaining. They are responsible for maintaining the structure of ecosystem. They are responsible for maintaining the structure of ecosystem. Responsible for maintaining the structure of ecosystem. They also determine the abundance. They also determine the abundance. Also determine the abundance and ensure the survival of other species. They also determine the abundance and ensure the survival of other species. And ensure the survival of other species. They can be both plants and animals. They can be both plants and animals. And I have given you many examples. For example, lemurs I have discussed. Starfish I have discussed. So they can be both plants and animals. See, if you give the definition of keystone species only on the basis of determining abundance and ensuring survival, then each and every species would be a keystone species. So hence it is essential to mention here that they are responsible for determining the structure of ecosystem. Without the word structure, it won't be properly defined. Clear? So they would be called as keystone species. But see, there are other species as well. For example, there's a type of species which is called as umbrella species. There's a type of species which is called as flagship species. And there is a type of species which is called as indicator species. Indicator species. Umbrella species, flagship species and indicator species. So there is a type of species which is called as umbrella species, type of species which is called as flagship species, type of species which is called as indicator species. Clear? Now what are these species? Now see, umbrella species means that suppose we are taking a conservation initiative for protecting one species. We have taken a conservation initiative for protecting one animal. But in that, what we would be doing? We would be protecting the habitat of that animal. But in protecting the habitat of that animal, the habitat of other species also can get protected in turn automatically. Now here the main species would be referred to as what? Here the main species would be referred to as umbrella species. For example, if you take the conservation initiative of protecting a tiger, what will happen in protecting the habitat of tigers? The habitat of hyena, the habitat of deer would also be protected. So tiger would be referred to as here what? Umbrella species. But if suppose you are using the symbol of one species, now in this case automatically it is getting, the other species are getting protected. But in another case, if we are using the symbol of one species for conservation initiative, we are using the symbol of one species for conservation initiative, but our motive is, but we can see that our motive is what? Our motive is to protect other species as well. If we are using, suppose we have taken the symbol of lion or tiger or elephant or crocodile and used it for conservation initiative, but our motive is to protect other species as well. We have a deliberate objective here. It's not automatically happening here. So we want to protect other species as well. We want to protect other species. So the species whose symbol would be used would be called as flagship species. Flagship species. And when we are talking about indicator species is to know about the condition of the ecosystem, is to identify an ecosystem. With the help of indicator species, we can identify an ecosystem. With the help of indicator species, we can know about the condition of the ecosystem. So with the help of indicator species, we can know about the condition. With the help of indicator species, we can identify an ecosystem. So that can be done. Clear? With the help of these species, we can identify an ecosystem. With the help of these species, we can know about the condition of the ecosystem. So that kind. For example, suppose if it is an old habitat, there would be spotted owls present. Now spotted owl can be used as an indicator species for old habitat because frequently they are present in old habitat, but infrequently they may be present in other habitat also. So it means that indicator species cannot be used for conclusion. Your conclusion should not be based on indicator species because it can sometimes turn wrong. So it is suggested that the conclusion should not be based on indicator species and you should use certain other benchmarks for that purpose. Clear? So first is what? First we have discussed what is called as umbrella species. Write down if umbrella species. First is umbrella species. Already you have discussed edge species and keystone species, umbrella species. If conservation initiative is taken for one species, if conservation initiatives is taken for one species, conservation initiative is taken for one species, if conservation initiative but in protecting the habitat of one species, in protecting the habitat of one species, the habitat of other species also gets, the habitat of other species also gets protected in turn. The habitat of other species also gets protected in turn. In turn means automatically. Then the main species here is referred to as, umbrella species. Write down. I repeat once more. If conservation initiative for one species is taken, and in protecting the habitat of one species, The habitat of other species also gets protected in turn. The habitat of other species also gets protected in turn. The main species here would be referred to as, main species here would be referred to as umbrella species. The main species here would be referred to as umbrella species. Umbrella species. On the other hand, if the symbol of one species, is used for conservation initiative, but the motive is to protect, other species as well, then it is referred to as flagship species. So what is the difference between umbrella and flagship? Umbrella and flagship, the difference is what? That the main species here is referred to as the umbrella species, and in the conservation initiative of umbrella species, automatically the other species are getting protected. But flagship species is a species which is used as a symbol, but the motive is to protect other species. Then it is called as what? It is called as flagship species. It is used as a symbol, but here there is a deliberate attempt. In this case, there is no deliberate attempt. There is a deliberate attempt to protect other species. Write down third, indicator species. These species are used to either identify an ecosystem. And also to know about its condition. Identify an ecosystem and also to know about its condition. For example, you would have seen Gangetic dolphins. Gangetic dolphins are called as swans. They would be moving in the mid of river Ganga. Why? Because less contaminant water is present. So movement of Gangetic dolphin is indicative of the fact that what is the level of contamination. Clear? Or suppose spotted owl. Spotted owl is present in old habitat. So generally they are present in old habitat. But we cannot derive the conclusion based on that. Clear? Because sometimes it can be wrong. So here we are saying that indicator species is used for identifying ecosystem and to know about its condition. But then having said so, do remember that you cannot base your entire conclusion on indicator species only. Why? Because sometimes it can be wrong. Write down. But the conclusion should not be based on indicator species only. Conclusion should not be based on indicator species only. Certain other benchmarks should also be selected. Clear? And I have given you two examples. One, I have given you an example of Gangetic dolphin. Second example, I have given you spotted owl, which is present in generally old habitat. Now, these are the terms with which we have to begin with. Now, sometimes in your examination, they tend to ask you questions from Principles of ecology. There are three main principles which we have to cover up. From GS perspective, there are three main principles which we have to cover up. And let's see what kind of questions that they have asked you in examination also. So let's cover up today principles of ecology. Write down a subheading, principles of ecology. And one by one we'll discuss, then write down. Clear? So that the notes is also with us and we know what to do. Write down first. Homeostatic principle. Principles of ecology. The first principle is homeostatic principle and resilience characteristic. Homeostatic principle and resilience characteristic. So what is this characteristic? What is this system all about? Let's know that. Now see, when you are talking about homeostatic principle and resilience characteristic, each and every, understand it, each and every ecosystem would be having a self-regulatory mechanism of its own. I am saying that each and every ecosystem would be having a self-regulatory mechanism of its own. That means what? That with the help of this mechanism, the internal condition within the ecosystem would be maintained despite external changes. So each and every ecosystem has a mechanism of its own, with the help of which it maintains the internal condition within the ecosystem despite external changes. Now this would be done by through some adjustment. I give you an example. When winter comes, you can see on the hair of animals, on the skin of animals, hair would be growing in large numbers. Why large numbers? Because winter is coming. There would be, what is the external condition? External condition is dip in temperature. Dip in temperature. And winter is coming, so external condition is the dip in temperature, and in order to adjust to that, what is happening? That the hairs on the skin of animals is growing in large number, because these hairs would be acting as an insulator. Or suppose I am shifted here from old Rajendra Nagar, New Delhi, directly to Siachen Glacier. There would be a change in my body. And what would be the change in my body? The RBC production in my body would be enhancing. Because Siachen Glacier is an area of low pressure. So in order to adjust to that area, the RBC production in my body would be enhancing. Clear? So this adjustment done by the ecosystem or the adaptation done by the ecosystem would be exhibiting its resilience characteristic, would be reflecting its resilience characteristic. Resilience means to adapt so that the damage is not there. Clear? So this ability of the ecosystem, by virtue of which it is adjusting or adapting to the external condition, would be called as what? It would be called as resilience limit, resilience characteristic. But then you cannot say that every time this would be exhibited. Suppose there is a volcanic eruption here, just the side of my digest. Cannot be that the ecosystem would be maintained. Ecosystem would be disrupted. So it means what? One can say also that the resilience characteristic of the ecosystem through which it is adjusting, it is adapting, the resilience characteristic of the ecosystem can be exhibited to a certain level only. And this level is called as what? This level would be called as resilience limit. But if the magnitude of external change, if suppose the nature of external change or magnitude of external change is such that the resilience limit of the ecosystem is breached. The resilience limit of the ecosystem is surpassed. It is at that juncture that environmental degradation happens. It is at that point that environmental degradation takes place. So the theoretical definition of environmental degradation is based on the passing of resilience limit of the ecosystem. Write down first principle, homeostatic principle and oblique resilience characteristic. Homeostatic principle and resilience characteristic. Write down each and every ecosystem would be having each and every ecosystem would be having an inbuilt self-regulatory mechanism, an inbuilt self-regulatory mechanism of its own, an inbuilt self-regulatory mechanism of its own. This would be with every ecosystem, with the help of which the internal conditions within the ecosystem, would be maintained. The internal conditions within the ecosystem would be maintained despite external changes, This characteristic of the ecosystem, certain adjustment would be done for that purpose. This characteristic of the ecosystem is referred to as the resilience characteristic. This characteristic of the ecosystem is referred to as the resilience characteristic. But this characteristic can be exhibited. To a certain level only, which is referred to as the resilience limit. But this characteristic of the ecosystem can be exhibited to a certain level only, called resilience limit. Now we have defined that this adjustment can be done to a certain level only. So this level would be called as resilience limit. But if the magnitude or nature of external change, is such that the resilience limit of the ecosystem is surpassed, And it means what? It means that the ecosystem is no longer able to adjust, the ecosystem is no longer able to adapt to maintain the internal conditions. That if the resilience limit of the ecosystem is surpassed, it is at that juncture that environmental degradation takes place. that environmental degradation takes place. So it means what? It means that the theoretical definition of environmental degradation is based on what? It is based on the passing of resilience limit of the ecosystem. Passing of resilience limit of the ecosystem. And see, I have mentioned two things here. One, I have mentioned the nature, and second, magnitude. Magnitude of external change means suppose volcanic eruption takes place. So magnitude of external change is such that the ecosystem, certainly we can see magnitude of external change is such that the resilience limit of the ecosystem would be surpassed. But also the nature. For example, suppose Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984. It was a tragedy in which the resilience limit of the ecosystem was surpassed because this was a chemical disaster. Chemical disaster. So both words would be used. Magnitude of external change and nature of external change. But do remember also the fact that as far as the resilience limit and the resilience characteristic as well as the homeostatic principle is concerned, all these principles can be exhibited to a certain level only. Write down principles of ecology. Principles of ecology. And the first principle is what? First principle is homeostatic principle. Oblique resilience characteristic. Homeostatic principle is too much wide. Homeostatic principle, and here resilience characteristic. Homeostatic principle, resilience characteristic. Write down each and every ecosystem. Each and every ecosystem has an inbuilt self-regulatory mechanism of its own. Has an inbuilt self-regulatory mechanism. Has an inbuilt self-regulatory mechanism of its own. By virtue of which the internal conditions within the ecosystem, would be maintained despite external changes. The ecosystem would be adjusting. Or adapting for this purpose. Obviously to maintain the internal conditions, or adapting for this purpose. This characteristic of the ecosystem is referred to as referred to as. This characteristic of the ecosystem is referred to as resilience characteristic. Resilience characteristic. Resilience characteristic. But this characteristic would be exhibited. But this characteristic would be exhibited. To a certain level only. To a certain level only. Which is referred to as. Resilience, which is referred to as resilience limit. Certain level only, which would be referred to as resilience limit. But if the nature of external change, or magnitude of external change is such that, but if the nature of external change or magnitude of external change is such that, the resilience limit of the ecosystem is surpassed. But if the nature of external change or magnitude of external change is such that the resilience limit of the ecosystem is surpassed, the resilience limit of the ecosystem is surpassed, it is at that juncture, that environmental degradation takes place. It is at that juncture that environmental degradation takes place. Now, that's your theoretical definition of environmental degradation. Clear? But remember that environmental degradation can be both natural or it can be anthropogenic also. Volcanic eruption is what? It's responsible for natural degradation. We cannot check out natural degradation, but we can check anthropogenic degradation. And see, in anthropogenic degradation also, the first degradation took place, transformation of nature took place when humans were responsible for converting natural ecosystem into agro ecosystem. So we converted what? We converted the natural ecosystem into agro ecosystem. So we converted that. Fine. So this was the first degradation that we were responsible for. So it was with the advent of agriculture that degradation took place. Now see. Now second principle is called as what? Second principle is referred to as plant succession. See, when we say succession, succession is what? Succession is the process which includes all ecological changes by virtue of which species get established in an area. Succession is what? Succession is a process which includes all ecological changes by virtue of which species get established in an area. If suppose the species are animal species, then it would be called as animal succession. If the species are vegetation, then it would be called as plant succession. So in a word, we can see plant succession is a process which includes all ecological changes by virtue of which not only vegetation would be getting established in an area. So by virtue of which vegetation gets established in an area. And see, it may happen that in any area there was no vegetation from very beginning. So the area where there was no vegetation from the very beginning, if vegetation gets established in that very area, now this process would be called as what? It would be called as primary plant succession. So one can see that this process is called as what? It is referred to as primary plant succession. The plant succession can be of two types. So here we are saying that primary but if suppose there was vegetation in that area from the very beginning, but due to drought or due to suppose forest fire, the vegetation was removed. So in this case, establishment of vegetation in an area which has temporarily witnessed loss of vegetation would be called as what? It would be called as secondary plant succession. So one is called as what? It is called as primary plant succession, and second would be called as secondary plant succession. Clear? Again, I repeat that primary plant succession would be taking place in those areas where there was no vegetation from the very beginning. So establishment of vegetation in that area would be called as primary plant succession. And why so? Because there was no vegetation in that area from the very beginning. But if suppose vegetation existed in that area and there is temporary loss of vegetation which can be due to wildfires or due to droughts, then this would be where temporary loss of vegetation takes place. In that area, if plant succession takes place, it would be called as secondary plant succession. And here it is established in an area which has not witnessed any kind of vegetation. Now, the vegetation which is established in that area where primary plant succession takes place is called as primary vegetation. And based on primary vegetation, there are two concepts in environment that you have to know. Clear? So write down second principle of ecology and we'll deal in detail about this. Write down plant succession. Plant succession. It is a process which includes all ecological changes, with the help of which vegetation gets established in an area. And see, and the plant succession would be of two types, primary and secondary. Primary plant succession would be a plant succession which takes place in those areas where there was no vegetation from the very beginning. Write down, plant succession can be of two types. Primary plant succession. And secondary plant succession. Primary plant succession takes place in an area. Where no vegetation is present from the very beginning. And secondary plant succession takes place in an area. Where there is temporary loss of vegetation. Then the establishment of vegetation will be called as secondary in nature, where there is temporary loss of vegetation. Clear? Fine. But see, when you talk about succession, we can see establishment of vegetation cannot take place instantaneously. It cannot take place abruptly. It's not that the vegetation would be getting established instantaneously or abruptly. Whenever vegetation gets established, it would be always getting established in a sequential manner. It would be always getting established in a sequential manner. Sequence. So the phased wise manner or the sequential manner through which vegetation is getting established is referred to as serrae. Is called as serrae. And there are three phases under serrae. Phase of climax plants, phase of pioneer plants, and phase of opportunist plant. Write down. Establishment of vegetation does not take place. Establishment of vegetation does not take place. Does not take place instantly. Instantly. Establishment of vegetation does not take place instantly. Instantly. It would always take place in a sequential manner. It would always take place in a sequential manner. Always take place in a sequential manner. And we can see the sequential manner through which vegetation is getting established would be called as what? It would be referred to as serrae. Write down. The sequential manner. The sequential manner through which vegetation gets established. Through which vegetation gets established. Through which vegetation gets established is referred to as serrae. The sequential manner through which vegetation gets established is referred to as what? It is referred to as serrae. Clear? And we can see that there are three stages in serrae. There are three stages in serrae. There are three stages in serrae. Now the first stage is what? The first stage is what is called as the phase of pioneer plant. Suppose in this area, large boulders are present. No vegetation is present, large boulders are present, rocks are present. So in the fissures of these rocks, suppose these are the rocks. So in the fissures of these rocks, small vegetation would be thriving. Small vegetation comes out in the fissures of these rocks. And these small vegetation would be responsible for what? It would be responsible for, first of all, broadening the fissures, and then is responsible for initiating soil formation. Broadening the fissures, and then it is responsible for starting soil formation. So since these vegetation are the first vegetation of this area, they are referred to as what? They are referred to as pioneer plants. Pioneer plants, as they are the first vegetation of this area, and they are responsible for what? They are responsible for soil formation, they are responsible for broadening of the fissures. Now see, after the formation of soil, small vegetation in this area would be growing. For example, grasses, herbs, or shrubs. Now they would be called as what? They would be called as opportunist plant. They would be referred to as what? They would be referred to as opportunist plant. And why so? Because the grasses, herbs would be surviving for 1 or 2 years and they die. So when they die, what will happen? See, there are two examples. First of all, here, come here, and I missed one thing. There are two examples of pioneer plant. One is called as lichens and second is called as mosses. Now lichens, they have asked you an examination in UPSC. Lichens is a combination of fungus with photosynthetic partner. On one side is the fungus and the second side is the photosynthetic partner. So what can be photosynthetic partner? Photosynthetic partner can be bacteria. Sometimes, generally it is what? Generally it is algae, because photosynthesis is performed by algae. But only some bacteria are responsible for doing so. So the photosynthetic partner is what? In the case of lichens would be algae. Clear? Now, mosses are flowerless plants which belong to the class of Bryophyta. When we are talking about opportunist plants, now here the broadening of fissures would take place, soil formation is done. Now after soil formation, the grasses, herbs can be noticed. Right down, after the formation of soil, small vegetation like grasses, herbs would be growing in this area. They would survive for 1 or 2 years. And we can see in this period, when they are surviving, they would be responsible for generating enormous amount of seeds. So they are responsible for ensuring the survival of their future generation. Clear? Ensuring the survival of their future generation. And the third stage would be called as what? It would be called as the stage of climax plants. Now in this phase, we can see trees having greater height would be growing in that area. And obviously the leaves of these trees would be obstructing what? Obstructing solar radiation. So when they obstruct solar radiation, the lower vegetation of this area would be very scarce. For example, pine tree, devdar. So we can see lower vegetation in this area would be very scarce. Why? Because the solar radiation has been obstructed by these trees. Write down from the very beginning, write down Sere. It is the sequential manner, Sere. It is the sequential manner through which vegetation gets established in an area. It is the sequential manner through which vegetation gets established in an area. There are 3 stages in Sere. First, the phase of pioneer plants. For example, lichens or mosses. The phase of pioneer plants. For examples, lichens or mosses. Lichens are a combination of fungus with photosynthetic partner. Which is generally an algae. Fungus with photosynthetic partner, which is generally an algae. But sometimes can be bacteria. Fungus with photosynthetic partner, which is generally an algae. but sometimes can be bacteria. And they have asked you this question in examination, that lichens is a combination of what? So lichens is a combination of, and they gave both the option, fungus with bacteria, fungus with algae. So if this kind of option is given, select that which is more common. So fungus with algae. Write down mosses are, mosses are, mosses are flowerless plants. Mosses are flowerless plants which belong to the class of Bryophyta. Mosses are flowerless plants which belong to the class of Bryophyta. Second stage. Second stage is what? It is the phase of opportunist plant. Write down phase of opportunist plant. Second stage, phase of opportunist plant. In this phase, after the formation of soil, in this phase, small vegetation like, already soil has been formed, small vegetation like grasses or herbs would be growing. Small vegetation like grasses or herbs would be growing. Grasses or herbs would be growing. They would be surviving for 1 or 2 years. They would be surviving for 1 or 2 years. They would be surviving for 1 or 2 years. But during this period, 1 or 2 years, but during this period, they generate, enormous amount of seeds. They generate enormous amount of seeds. Ensuring the survival of their future generation. Ensuring the survival of their future generation. It means what? It means that they are acting for themselves only. So since they are acting for themselves only, they are selfish in nature. That's why it is called as what? It is referred to as opportunist plant. So grasses, herbs would be falling under the category of what? Opportunist plant. Clear. Third, climax plants. Third, climax plants. Climax plants. During this phase, trees having greater height, would be established in this area. Trees having greater height would be established in these areas. The leaves of these trees would be obstructing solar radiation. The leaves of these trees would be obstructing solar radiation. As a result, the lower vegetation is very scarce. As a result, the lower vegetation is very scarce. And many examples of climax plants you can give. For example, pine, devdar, oak, spruce. So all these examples can be given. But remember that when you talk about, just 1 second. When we talk about these 3 types of vegetation, not vegetation, these 3 stages of Sere, where are these 3 stages of Sere witnessed in India? These 3 stages of Sere would be witnessed in India in Himalayas. And why so Himalayas only? Because Himalayas are the youngest mountain range of the world, still in the process of their formation. So these stages would be witnessed. For example, suppose we talk about upper Himalayas, greater Himalayas. We can see in this, in the upper or the greater Himalayas, the concern is what? You have, see, environmental degradation is taking place everywhere. Yes, see, you can consider them as indicative species also, because they are attached with idea of climate change also. Mosses and lichens, if they are present, it means that climate change is taking place. Now, I have given you the example of Sere. All these things, why? Because when you talk about Himalayas, Himalayas are the youngest mountain range of the world. They are still in the process of their formation. So, in the greater Himalayas, the upper Himalayas or the greater Himalayas, you can see that in this area, either the snow-capped mountains are present, or where the snow-capped mountains are not present, lichens and mosses would be present in large numbers. Lichens and mosses are indicative of climate change. Why? Because when the snow melts, then lichens and mosses would be growing in large numbers. Clear? So it is indicative, and melting of snow is nothing but an adverse impact of global warming. Now we can see that in Himalayas, lichens and mosses are present in the greater Himalayas where there is no snow. So it is indicative of certainly global warming and climate change. But when you come to the middle Himalayas, you can see either lichens and mosses, or you can see grasses, herbs. So this is telling us about what it is telling us about middle Himalayas. And when you come to outer Himalayas, the Shivaliks, you can see pine forest, devdar present in large numbers. Clear? Present in large. So all the three stages of Sere are reflected in Himalayas, because Himalayas are still the youngest mountain range of the world and still in the process of its formation. Write down all the three stages of Sere. All the three stages of Sere are reflected in Himalayas. Are reflected in Himalayas. As Himalayas are the newest mountain range of the world. As Himalayas are the newest mountain range of the world. Newest mountain range of the world. Still in the process of its formation. Are the newest mountain range of the world, still in the process of its formation. As Himalayas are the newest mountain range of the world, still in the process of its formation. Clear? Fine. Formation. Now see, the third principle of ecology is what is called as ecological productivity. Suppose this is your coastal area, and this area is of mangrove swamps. This area is of mangrove swamp, and on one side is the land, here is the water. So we can see that the next thing that you have to know is called as, the next principle that you have to know is called as what? It is called as ecological productivity. See, ecological productivity means what? When plants are responsible for performing photosynthesis, what happens? They generate natural organic matter, which can be in the form of polysaccharides or cellulose. So the rate at which natural organic matter would be generated by plants, or the rate, simply you can say not plants, because other agencies are also responsible for doing so. So if suppose we say that rate at which natural organic matter would be generated, would be called as what? It would be called as ecological productivity. Because you know, when photosynthesis is performed, what is generated? Polysaccharide, cellulose. And these are what? These are natural organic matter. So this would be called as ecological productivity. So the rate at which natural organic matter is generated would be referred to as what? It would be referred to as ecological productivity. Ecological productivity. Very good. And that's the definition of ecological productivity. So you can see ecological productivity would be depending on two main factors. One is the amount of solar radiation, and second is the ability of plants through which it is responsible for converting solar energy into chemical energy, so that it can be used where? It can be used, solar energy into chemical energy, so that it can be used in photosynthesis. So you can see that two factors. One is the amount of solar radiation. So if suppose amount of solar radiation is one factor, so productivity would be maximum on the globe where? In the tropical rainforest. But it would be reducing if we move towards the poles. And maximum ecological productivity on earth is present in tropical rainforest. Tropical rainforest. That registers maximum ecological productivity. Fine, that registers maximum ecological productivity, so it is present in tropical rainforest. Productivity of oceans is not very high, because if we suppose consider the productivity of oceans, it's not very high, because first of all, the sunlight is hindered by the solar radiation, obstructed by the solar radiation, and the second thing is what? The lack of nutrients present in saline water. Lack of nutrients present in saline water. That makes the productivity of oceans less. But if we talk about that part of the ocean which is near the coast, in this area, that part of the ocean which is near the coast, in this area productivity is very high. What is the reason in this area that the productivity is very high? So first of all, that when rivers come, they are responsible for carrying along with it sediments, and these sediments have nutrients in them which gets deposited over here. And this would be enhancing the concentration of what? Concentration of phytoplanktons and algae. In this area, the concentration. And these are what? These are nothing but primary producers of the food chain. Primary producers of the food chain they are. They are autotroph in nature. So productivity of oceans is not as high as it should have been. And it's not as high as it should have been. Why? The reason for this is why? The productivity of oceans is not as high as it should have been. The reason is first is the obstruction of solar radiation, second is lack of nutrients in saline water. But in those parts of the ocean which is near the coast and where corals are present, in this area the productivity would be very high. Productivity is very high. And this area is called as what? This area is referred to as tropical rainforest of oceans. So in this area, the productivity is very high. Now the reason for high productivity of this area is what? First of all, when rivers, they carry the sediments, they deposit it here, it enhances the nutrient content. So the algae or the phytoplankton which are present in this area would be doing what? They would be deriving nutrients from these segments to grow in large numbers, and that would be enhancing the productivity. And not only this, in these areas we can see corals are also present, and corals happen to be in a symbiotic relationship with zoox and we know. So corals are also present in this area, and corals, Zoox anthellae, which is in a symbiotic relationship with corals, is responsible for enhancing ecological productivity. Would be responsible for enhancing ecological productivity. So that's the other reason that we talk about. At least today, the definition, and this much should be done. So this area of ocean, which is where the corals are present, which registers very high ecological productivity, would be called as what? It would be called as tropical rainforest of oceans. This area would be referred to as tropical Write down ecological productivity. Third principle we are dealing with. Ecological productivity. As much as we can write till 4 o'clock. Ecological productivity. It is the rate at which natural organic matter is generated. It is the rate at which natural organic matter is generated. Organic matter is generated per unit area, per unit time. Natural organic matter is generated per unit area, per unit time. It depends upon two factors. It depends upon two factors. Two factors. First, the amount of solar radiation. It depends upon two factors. First, the amount of solar radiation, and second, the ability of plants through which it converts solar energy, the ability of plants through which it converts solar energy into chemical energy. It converts solar energy into chemical energy. Maximum ecological productivity on earth is in tropical rainforest. Maximum ecological productivity of earth is in tropical rainforest. Oceans register low ecological productivity. Low ecological productivity due to obstruction of solar radiation, in water body, and second, lack of nutrients in saline water, But that part of the ocean which is near the coast, and where corals are also present, is called as tropical rainforest of oceans. Due to high ecological productivity. high ecological productivity. Is that clear? But right down in this area, rivers bring the sediments, which enhances the nutrient content of this area, which is utilized by phytoplanktons and algae, to grow in large numbers, And they are what? They are nothing but autotrophs. Write down. They are autotrophs responsible for photosynthesis. And we can see in this area, the corals are in a symbiotic relationship with a primary producer called zooxanthellae. Write down. In this area, the corals are in a symbiotic relationship with. In this area, the corals are in a symbiotic relationship with primary producer zooxanthellae. Corals are in a symbiotic relationship with primary producer zooxanthellae. So if suppose we talk about the ecological productivity of this area, the ecological productivity of mangrove swamps is very high. Why? Because this is an ecotone, mangroves. So ecological productivity of mangroves is 2500 gram per centimeter square per year. That's how it is represented. Gram per centimeter square per year, 2500. But here if we suppose take, we can see that the coral bed itself has an ecological productivity of 2000. The algal bed over here itself would be having an ecological productivity of 2000. So if we take combined ecological productivity of this area, it's greater than mangrove swamps. So this area is called as what? It is referred to as tropical rainforest of ocean because of high ecological productivity. If you talk about estuary is also an ecotone. It would be having a productivity of 18,000 gram per centimeter square per year. If we talk about cultivated land would be having ecological productivity of what? Ecological productivity of 650 gram per centimeter square per year. If they talk about open oceans has a low ecological productivity of 125 gram per centimeter square. It is in the coastal area that the productivity of oceans is high. Clear? Productivity of oceans is high. In examination, they have asked you a question that arrange the following in order of decreasing ecological productivity, and they have asked you oceans, mangrove, grasslands and lakes. Oceans, mangrove, grassland and lakes. The correct order would be what? Mangrove would be first. Followed by what? Followed by grassland. Because look at the surface area that is responsible for performing photosynthesis. Followed by what? Followed by lakes, because deposition of sediment also takes place in the lakes. And followed by oceans, because it's not mentioned which part of the ocean. The open oceans in general would be having high ecological productivity. Clear? This much for today, all of you. Let me see the questions, last 2 or 3 questions which they have asked. Can corals originate in muddy waters? Not at all. Corals are never present in river water. Corals would be always present in marine ecosystem, that too in the coastal areas. And they are present, I told you corals are marine organism itself, so they won't be present. Sir, is not near of the coastal area lack of oxygen, then how can coral grow? See, when you are talking about sir, is not near of coastal areas lack of oxygen, then how corals grow up? See, corals, they grow in mainly the continental shelf. In coastal areas, there lack of oxygen definitely, but the corals are situated at the bottom. Corals are situated at the bottom, and if suppose oxygen is lacking deep inside the water, from 600 to 1200 meters deep, oxygen minimum zone is present. So this won't be affecting the corals as such. But corals are affected by oceanic acidification, which is an adverse impact of global warming and climate change. Clear? Muddy waters corals are not present because they are not present in lakes. They are not present in rivers. They would be only present in marine ecosystem. Clear? This much for today. Thank you so much. The queries have been answered also. Tomorrow we meet, and after, in the last few minutes, we will be having a test on whatever we have studied. Till tomorrow, let's have a test, and then some contemporary issues in between also, like that we had today. Tomorrow also we'll try to have more and more of contemporary issues. Clear? Thank you so much.